Hello and welcome. You're watching France 24. Coming up, a special edition. In that special edition, we're going to be in Normandy paying a tribute to the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Live coverage of the main international ceremony coming up from Juno Beach in the Canadian sector of the Normandy landings. Earlier, Emmanuel Macron expressing France's gratitude to the sacrifice of U.S. soldiers. The French president, alongside U.S. counterpart Donald Trump, at the American cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer. Macron also stood alongside the outgoing UK Prime Minister Theresa May to break ground for the British D-Day memorial that happened near Gold Beach. Hello everyone, I'm François Picard. Welcome to this special edition. Yes, it's a little piece of U.S. soil inside an 80-kilometer stretch of Normandy Beach where that ceremony took place with Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron earlier. The American cemetery in Colleville-sur-Mer, the tribute to the 150,000 Allied troops who landed 75 years ago today to free France from the Nazis. Before a lunch between the two presidents and their wives in nearby Caen, Macron awarding the Legion of Honor, France's highest award for merit, to 5 U.S. veterans.
Je m'incline, et à nos vétérans et à leur nation, je dis merci. We know what we owe to you veterans, our freedom. On behalf of my nation, I just want to say thank you.
This evening, we thank God for the brave sons of the United Kingdom and the United States who defeated the Nazis and the Nazi regime and liberated millions from tyranny. The bond between our nations was forever sealed in that great crusade.
All right, those images of Donald Trump were from a few days back. We'll play you what Donald Trump said earlier on the Normandy beaches a little bit later on. The ceremonies have been taking place all day. Emmanuel Macron right now attending a ceremony taking place near for the 177 French who took part in D-Day commemorations. These are live pictures saluting the Commando Kiefer, the French battalion that took part in the Normandy landing. This taking place near Ouistreham, not far from the city of Caen. The French president, who is leaving alongside his wife Brigitte Macron after taking part in that ceremony. He'll be represented by the French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe at the main international ceremony a little bit later on. The first time that international ceremony is taking place in the Canadian sector for D-Day. Now, for those of you just joining us here on France 24, we're going to be crossing over live to that ceremony in a bit. First, I want to say hello to our guests for the next 2 hours here. Historian Jacob Field, the author of D-Day Numbers, his upcoming book, The Eccentric Mr. Churchill, Little Known Facts About the Greatest Britain. Thanks for being with us. It's a memorable day, and we want to welcome as well historian Dieter Goswinkel of the Free University of Berlin, visiting professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening.
So we're on D-Day and the big international ceremony still to come. I want to begin with protocol. I'll begin with you, Jacob Field, because you have piecemeal, all of these different ceremonies taking place. For other big commemorations, we had all the leaders together in one place. I remember covering the 50th anniversary, where you had on the beach at Utah Beach, Bill Clinton, the Queen of England, the leaders of most of the nations. Here, it's smaller individual ceremonies. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think now, as we're moving forward to the next D-Day celebration, will be the 100th, where a lot of the veterans will be gone. So I think this D-Day is much more personal about celebrating individual veterans, and that means taking a slightly narrower look at individual actions. And I think it's kind of fitting that we have many celebrations spread across the few days, which gives every country, every participant nation a different chance to be in the spotlight. And I think it's, rather fitting that we've got these smaller, slightly more personal celebrations going on.
All right, we're showing you those images a moment ago from near Ouistreham, where the French president's been saluting the Kiefer Commando, the French troops that took part in D-Day, June the 6th, 1944. France 24's Chris Moore is not very far off. He joins us live now from Courseulles-sur-Mer. Courseulles-sur-Mer, where the big international ceremony is getting ready to start, Chris.
That's right, yes. Many nations represented here today, and those gathered here set to be addressed by the French Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, and his Canadian counterpart, Justin Trudeau. They've already addressed a Canadian ceremony here this morning. The reason being, as you just said, this is Juno Beach, the 10-kilometre stretch of Normandy coastline, sandwiched between two beaches for which the British had responsibility on D-Day, Gold and Sword, and tributes paid to the 14,000 Canadians who landed on that beach. And as was the case for the British, as was the case for the Americans, losses on that first day, very heavy, 1,000 people losing their lives in those first few hours. Veterans were here this morning. They'll be here again this evening, and the message at this ceremony, the same as it was at the British one, the same as it was at the American one. This is the 75th anniversary. These guys are now well into their 90s, most of them, some of them even over 100 years of age. And the organisers of all these events really encouraging people to pay tribute and remember what they did while they're still with us.
Chris, it's a moving day, both for those veterans who are returning and also for the locals.
That's right, yes. You can't escape D-Day here in Normandy. It's very much part of the landscape just down the coast at Arromanches, which was near the British responsibility Gold Beach. You can still see various bits of military hardware in the sea and along the shoreline. And of course, the cliff tops and fields are littered with cemeteries, as is much of northern France. Now, marking D-Day was something which has taken various forms in terms of the local traditions, local culture here. But out amongst the crowds today, there are, of course, as I said, veterans, their families. There are many Americans who've come to pay their tributes, many Brits who've crossed the channel to do the same, and many local Normans who are keen to reiterate the message that Emmanuel Macron put across at the American ceremony earlier today, namely that his country will never forget.
Chris Moore, many thanks, and we'll be crossing live to that ceremony in just a few short minutes. Dieter Goswinkel, you heard Chris Moore talk about the different cemeteries. They, of course, include German cemeteries. Just a few weeks back, they found, while doing digs near the city of Caen, more remains of soldiers who took part in the Battle of Normandy. Regularly, there are soldiers who are found, because they're still missing soldiers from that battle, and they're regularly laid to rest in those cemeteries.
Yes, there is six. I think there are 6 German cemeteries on the next to the Norman coast, and I think the number of victims of German soldiers is about the same as that of the Allied troops landing in Normandy. Yeah, they have to be buried there, and since the 50s, but due to a better relationship between the German and French government, it was possible to bury them in these cemeteries.
We saw the German Chancellor Angela Merkel present here for November 11th for the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. Should she have been present today?
She was in Portsmouth, I think. And I would have liked to see her today. Yeah, I would have liked. I'm not sure whether she should have been there, but she might have been there. And I think due to these good relationships between Germany and France, Macron, le président Macron, should have invited her.
How do Germans see D-Day?
Germans see it as an extremely important military event. Because this was the end of the beginning of the German defeat. Not the beginning, but one important step to the German defeat after Stalingrad. And let's say the last phase of World War II. And there is quite a lot of commemoration, but much less than in France and certainly in Great Britain.
All right, casualties, as we were saying, on both sides. What was it like on the home front for those, for instance, back in England? How did they cope? For that, well, you can turn to Jennifer Ryan's previous novel, The Chilbury Ladies' Choir. Her new novel is called The Spies of Shilling Lane. It's more about the Blitz than about D-Day itself. But I want to welcome you, Jennifer, to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Where you are today, how much is D-Day being looked at by, how much coverage is it getting in the United States? How big a place does it have in the hearts and minds of Americans right now?
I think it's huge. It's getting a huge amount of coverage here. I think it's considered the big moment for the success of the Allies in the Second World War. And I mean, I think on any terms, it was a massive moment historically.
And your thoughts on what this 75th means?
Well, I think, I think it's a really good time to look back on that era and what it's meant for the culture of warfare and society and their understanding on the whole of what happened in the Second World War. And, people are talking a lot about women, the role of women, for example, in the Second World War, and how that it really was a bit of a turning point. I think in about 1940, after the occupation of France, there really was, the British really decided to expand the espionage organizations. And since a lot of the men were already caught up in different military organizations by that point in the war, they decided there was a lot of space for women, they decided. And it happened very gradually, and there was an awful lot of kickback from the establishment about that. But little by little, they started to realize that women were actually incredibly valuable, particularly in espionage for infiltration purposes.
The memory of what was World War II, what was D-Day, the role played by those at the front, those played behind the front lines. It's something that this question of memory, it was brought up in the speech, and it was a long one by Donald Trump earlier at Colleville-sur-Mer at the American cemetery. We're going to listen to the U.S. president talking during that speech.
Today we remember those who fell, and we honor all who fought right here in Normandy. They won back this ground for civilization to more than 170 veterans of the Second World War who join us today. You are among the very greatest Americans who will ever live. You are the pride of our nation. You are the glory of our republic. and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
The choice of words there by Donald Trump, talking about winning back for civilization, winning back the ground for civilization. What are your thoughts on that, on those words, Jacob Field?
Well, I think in the West, one way we can view World War II and in the Soviet Union as well, as there's a great clash between civilizations. You've got democracy against fascism. And that's why I think World War II lives so long in the popular memory, because in many respects, it's a war that's very easy to conceptualize. It's good against evil, and there's less blurred grey lines. Even though they did exist in reality, when you view it like that, you can say, well, it's civilization against the forces of evil.
He used several times the word crusade. There was a crusade, is how he put it. How does that sit with historians?
Well, I think crusade is not really an accurate word to use. I think, the USA has a strong belief in the separation of church and state. And I think crusade is maybe a little strong. This was an important war to fight back the forces of fascism. But I think when you throw around terms like crusade so loosely, I think it's a little problematic.
The French President Emmanuel Macron, he at one point in his speech said, quote, "America is never as great as when it shows itself faithful to the universal values that its founding fathers defended, like when nearly 2.5 centuries ago, France came to help its independence." Obviously, everybody reads into these speeches current politics.
Yeah, I think that was a very nice reminder of Macron of the history of the birth of the American Republic, that it's not possible without the money and soldiers and sailors of the Kingdom of France as it was at the time. And I think he's making a little point there about the importance of international cooperation, working together. And it'd be interesting to know what happened behind the scenes when they met.
Is D-Day the chance to remind audiences worldwide that there is a bit of an illiberal wind sometimes now that's blowing over the Allies, particularly when it comes to Donald Trump?
I think it's a good opportunity to remind the world of, let's say, the great points of liberal democracy. And I forgot to say, when you ask me how is German public looking at D-Day, I think for the younger generations, D-Day is something like the beginning of the German liberation. And even in Germany, Germans think that D-Day, younger generations, that D-Day is something like a liberation, event of liberation for any German.
All right, France's president, we mentioned earlier Angela Merkel, who is not present. He also chose not to invite Vladimir Putin. The Russian president's presence at 70th anniversary of D-Day commemorations 5 years ago, you'll recall, was a chance to hold a sideline mediation summit with Ukraine. Russia, which did not take part, by the way, in the Normandy landing. Now, the Kremlin this Thursday downplaying the significance of D-Day.
According to historians, the Normandy landing did not fundamentally influence the outcome of World War II. This was predetermined as a result of Red Army victories, mostly in Stalingrad and Kursk.
Do you share her interpretation, Dieter Goswinkel, of the relative significance, she says, of D-Day?
Well, there is some truth behind it, because Stalin and the Soviet Union played an extremely important role in drawing back National Socialism. And if we think of civilization, if we think of liberal democracy, we shouldn't forget, for military reasons and political reasons, that the Soviet troops sacrificed millions of soldiers to make D-Day possible and to make it a success.
You heard Dieter Goswinkel, who regretted the absence of Angela Merkel. Do you regret the absence of Vladimir Putin at these ceremonies?
Well, I think it does present political problems having someone like Vladimir Putin there, but I think it would also be a great opportunity for a sort of sense of reconciliation, because, you have to take seriously the Soviet sacrifice during World War II. One of the reasons why the German forces were undermanned in Normandy was because they were fighting off a huge Red Army onslaught in the East. But having said that, on the other side of things, if D-Day doesn't work, if it's not a success, it's going to put a huge strain on the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western allies, and which was a very fragile alliance.
Earlier, there was the French president, Emmanuel Macron, also with a nod to the British, more than just a nod. He and Theresa May took part in a ceremony breaking ground for the new British memorial that will be in Normandy. There you see the Normandy beaches. This one taking place near Gold Beach. It's a report read by Anke Uller.
Just like when they set foot on Nazi-occupied France, the new British Normandy Memorial in Ver-sur-mer encapsulates the courage and determination of D-Day soldiers.
22,442 servicemen and women under British command lost their lives in Normandy.
None of them wanted to be part of another war. But when the test came, when freedom had to be fought for or abandoned, they fought.
At a time when divisions are once again emerging in Europe, political leaders try to show a united front.
Nothing can erase ties generated by spilled blood and common values. The debates of today will not weaken but strengthen our shared history and our common future.
On the 6th of June, 1944, the British Army's 50th Infantry Division landed here at the onset of Operation Overlord. They were among the 156,000-strong Allied troops who took part in the invasion.
Jennifer Ryan, what would you like to see in that British memorial?
I think more of a nod towards women. I think, especially immediately after the Second World War, there was almost a big silence about the role that women played, which was massive. It was massive, and I think a lot of that stems from the idea that, you know, women, this pretense that women weren't really playing a big military role. When they were, I mean, they were doing a huge amount. Really, very early on in the war, in the UK, in Britain, they were manning anti-aircraft guns, which were, I mean, they were launching rockets into the sky to take down German aircraft. I think it's incontestable, and even Churchill said at the time, "A gun is a gun," and his own daughter, was one of the anti-aircraft gunners too, in part of these teams, and I think it's incontestable that they were very central to it, and it was only until the 1990s that began to be understood.
It was also a turning point, you might say, for the labor force. In the United States, there was the expression of Rosie the Riveter, because so many men were at the front, women taking jobs that traditionally were reserved for men.
That's right. It was in a lot of ways, it posed an incredible opportunity for women to really show their resourcefulness and their abilities to pick up new work.
Jennifer Ryan, when you look at the way it's spread out along all those beaches, and we're watching, by the way, live images of the French Prime Minister arriving at the ceremony that's about to open, the big international ceremony taking place for the first time inside the Canadian sector. Your thoughts on this? Well, as we were saying here in the studio, this multilateral effort of war.
Yeah, I mean, I think by that point in the Second World War, I think it was D-Day, the success of D-Day was just so huge. I mean, they really need to, you know, make sure that it really did work very well. So, I mean, it was planned for years, and into multinational cooperation went into it. And I think, and it's great to see that today, that everyone's coming together to celebrate it together.
Celebrate it together. And one of the other lessons of 75 years ago was put to our own Mark Owen. Earlier at the British Memorial Ceremony, D-Day veteran Joe Catini, 95 years old. He was in the 86th Field Regiment of the Hertfordshire Yeomanry Royal Artillery. Well, he spoke to Mark.
Ver-sur-mer, to me, is where I first landed and where the regiment first had its first position for firing further inland. Previous to that, we'd been firing from the sea. We'd fired 5 miles out, a creeping barrage for the infantry. And to be on dry land for the first time as a gun position, it was something fantastic.
Absolutely amazing. Joe, can I ask you, before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your day of commemoration, and obviously a lot of it will be very, very sombre, but what would your message be to world leaders? Emmanuel Macron's been here, Theresa May, Donald Trump's in the vicinity. What would your message be to those world leaders?
Don't ever start another war. Keep the peace, because you don't know what war brings. It's very, very traumatic, and it only brings grief to others.
All right. And again, you were saying it at the outset of the show, Jacob. These men are well into their 90s, most of them, some more than 100 who've made the trip this time. It's for many, this one, perhaps the next is the last of the big numbers that end in 0 or 5. The last big D-Day commemorations where we'll see actual veterans.
Yes, this is our last chance to get their living testimony, because, you know, these men and some women too are living history, and without their stories, we don't really get a sense of the personal insight of just how terrible and awful a thing like war is.
For years after the Normandy landing, some would already regularly come back. For others, it took, in some cases, half a century, 60 years before they'd wanted to come back.
Yeah, I think nowadays there's a little bit more of understanding of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot more of the understanding of the huge psychological toll which war takes on people. And many of the men on both sides who fought simply didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to go home, try and get on with their lives as best they could, and that meant not going back to the site of what would have been one of the most traumatic moments of their lives.
Yeah, we forget first wave, the people who landed at dawn on June the 6th, 1944, 50% either dead or wounded in that first wave, Dieter Goswinkel. And it's true that expressions like post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist at the time.
It didn't exist, but the fact existed, and it had already existed after World War I. We know that as historians, that this is something we know from the history of post-history of the First World War.
But yeah, we talked about in those days of people who were shell-shocked,
exactly, exactly. But there were hundreds of thousands, and even medical treatment for them in Germany and in France, wherever. We didn't call it like that, but we knew that it existed. So at the end of World War II and after World War II, now we know it much better, and I think lots of these veterans, also German veterans, were not able, and are still not able, if they're still alive, not able to go back to this battleground. I read some reports on that, and one of the last remaining German veterans came back, and he was nearly unable to stay there, and he had deserted. He had deserted after this battle, and because he couldn't stand any longer this mass slaughter.
And being on the German side of it, and we forget as well, the Battle of Normandy didn't happen over one day. It happened over really 2.5 months. And then on top of it, a lot of these soldiers then fought a bloody battle over the winter in the Ardennes forest, where there was a big German counteroffensive. Yeah,
the last German counteroffensive, which failed, cost 20,000 of victims, and even more. And this was the last offensive, but after that, the Allied troops were able to invade Germany. They came to Aachen, and then from the east, they entered German territory, and this made it possible that in March they crossed the Rhine, and 2 months later war was over. But in that way, D-Day was a very, very important step to that defeat, German defeat, and the victory of the Allies.
Those veterans that come back, does the story of D-Day get amended or rewritten over the years is the question.
It's a good question. I think it's always, as historians, we know that all these events, all these important things, important events in history are always rewritten. They're always rewritten, and today we know, maybe it has become more clear that D-Day also wasn't only the let's say the beginning of the German defeat, but also to some extent the beginning of Cold War.
Jacob Field, we're seeing the images now of Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the company of his French counterpart Edouard Philippe arriving. 75th anniversary of D-Day, the first time that the commemoration is happening in the Canadian sector. Your thoughts on that?
I think it's really essential because sometimes the Canadians get a little bit left out of the D-Day story. And I'd like to bring things back to 1942, to the Dieppe raid, Operation Jubilee.
It was like a dry run at the time.
Exactly. It was 5,000 Canadian soldiers with some US Army Rangers and British troops, and it was a mess. 70% casualties. And a lot of people in Canada thought we're being sacrificed here for no good reason. And the Dieppe raid was a tragic failure on the part of the Allies. But it taught a lot of very important lessons about, firstly, the need for airborne support, and secondly, the need for a strong bombardment beforehand. So the Canadians paid a huge price, which the rest of the Allies benefited.
That's an argument that's still raging, whether or not that raid in Dieppe was worth it.
Well, the families of the soldiers involved probably would say no, but strategically, you know, war compels huge sacrifices to be made. And one thing which the Dieppe raid led to was very heavy prior bombardment, which civilians were caught up on. And this was not a decision which leaders like Eisenhower took lightly, and it was not a decision which any Allied leaders took lightly. And of course, you know, in Germany, the huge civilian toll which took place because of area bombing carried out by the Allies.
Because we've illustrated, and we talked about it in our coverage of the centennial of the end of World War I, how during the First World War, soldiers were used as quote-unquote cannon fodder. You're saying that when General Eisenhower is overseeing Operation Overlord, he's got that in mind?
I think any general who's leading people into battle has to accept the fact that some of them are going to die when they come in contact with the enemy. But I think Eisenhower wanted to minimize the casualties as much as possible, because let's remember that a lot of the soldiers who fought in D-Day, this is the very first time they're going into battle. The 101st Airborne, when they're being parachuted into Normandy, this is their first combat operation, so they're not hardened troops by any means.
Jennifer Ryan, those U.S. soldiers and British soldiers and Canadian soldiers and others, they've been in England now, in some cases for years, waiting for this day. And a lot of the accounts at the time say people were getting a little stir-crazy.
Of personnel, machinery, ships, everything on the south coast of England, and apparently it was the whole place was chock-a-block, and it was absolutely frenetic. And there's an account of an American journalist, Martha Gellhorn, who actually managed to get over to D-Day. She was the one and only woman who was there. She managed to, and she just said it was mayhem. It was completely packed, and it was very difficult to work out exactly who was who and what exactly was going on, just on the days running up to D-Day. But she managed to disguise herself. Women were not allowed to go to D-Day, and she disguised herself as a medical orderly and sneaked onto a hospital ship and hid in the bathroom. And it was only when they actually reached Normandy that she got out and jumped off the ship and managed to take some photographs and get into the action.
And what happened? Did she? Was her cover blown?
Well, by the time she was there. So you know, she whipped off the the disguise and was busy, you know, taking notes and wiring back to New York.
So so yeah, you could hardly send her back at that point. Let's cross over now to Colleville-sur-Mer and have a look now as we see France's Prime Minister review the troops. At the outset, we're now into this international ceremony to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Allied landing on the Normandy beaches.
Des élèves de différents pays vont lire à présent un texte de leur choix.
Students from different countries will now read a text of their choice.
Pour le Royaume-Uni,
For United Kingdom,
Remember, by James Gill. How silent are the beaches? How peaceful is the scene? Give now a little thought to what this place has seen. Can you see the sacrifice? Can you see those desperate days that brought us all to death's dark valley, where brave men dared to stray? They waded through the water. They dashed across the sand. They chased death up the beaches and gave freedom to that land. And every now and then, remember what they gave. Remember how they lived and died, and cherish what they saved.
Pour la République tchèque.
For the Czech Republic.
V mlze slunce, v závoji noci, ve třpitu písku, vítr a moře zpívají stále stejnou píseň jako tenkrát.
Okay, so there's children from different countries reading a poem. Yeah, the makeup, as we saw on that podium, Jacob Field. So we have the Canadian Prime Minister representing the United States. We see the leader of the opposition, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, is there.
Yeah, interesting that she snuck in there, and that's maybe why they kind of split up all the ceremonies, because they wanted to keep them apart. But
she was present earlier in the day.
Okay, yeah.
As well.
I think it's fitting we have a Democrat there, in a sense, because she's an important post in of herself. And let's not forget Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the great Democrat presidents. So I think it's very important that she plays a role in some way.
This ceremony taking place again in the Canadian sector. We were talking earlier with Jacob Field about the significance of the Canadian war effort in World War II. The fact that they move from place to place. Dieter Goswinkel, again, we see those images of the leadership that's there. The international ceremony should be, it's the culmination of the day. Should the heads of state be there?
I would prefer, but well, it might, yeah, it's the French Prime Minister and other representatives. If it's, let's say, something like the last big ceremony of this day, the heads of state should be there. I think so too. But le président Macron didn't want to be there. I don't know for what reasons exactly, but
he was at a ceremony earlier.
Yeah, I know.
Just a short while ago, for the French commando, which is obviously, it's very hard, by the way. Traffic is very difficult because these are small secondary roads, and so he's not. That ceremony taking place just a short while ago for the Kiefer Commando.
Yeah, in Caen.
Near Caen. And we're hearing, poems read by children of all the different nationalities. Czech. This time it's Poland, Jacob Field, which the Polish who did take part in D-Day.
Yeah, several ships of the Free Polish Navy played a role in the Armada. In fact, one, the Polish ship Dragon, was actually sunk deliberately to create a breakwater to build the artificial harbour, Port Winston Churchill. So the Poles played a really important role both in the crossing and also the Polish air crews who helped with the aerial bombardment. And then the Free Polish Army were some of the most fearsome fighters in World War II.
So the Polish present on both fronts, you might say, because as well, obviously they were at this point in time, the battle was still raging for Poland between the Soviets and the Germans.
Yeah, so the great tragedy of Polish history to always be caught up in the crossroads of Europe. So we've talked a lot about the French resistance, but the Polish resistance, the Polish partisans, huge sacrifices which they made throughout the war.
We can cross back now to Chris Moore, who's live at the ceremony, watching along as we hear those children from the various nations, those children reading those poems commemorating the day. We're going to hear, in fact, the poem by the representative of New Zealand. Actually, let's listen in.
Account of D-Day by Wanganui-born Philip Stewart, who was a flight lieutenant with No. 1 Squadron RAF Fighter Command. The day before D-Day, the invasion fleet appeared and were patrolling up and down off the coast, and we could see them very, very clearly. Just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ships of all sizes and descriptions, from battleships down to quite small merchant vessels, which were carrying troops as well. Just an incredible fleet. Because of weather conditions, they were delayed for one day, and the whole of that day, they're just cruising up and down the coast. And our officers' quarters, that were the hotel on the cliffs above, and we had a very good view straight out to sea. We had an absolute grandstand view, incredible. The next day, I can remember looking down on the ships which were crossing. It took them a long time to get the whole lot over, and in a lot of them, the troops were out on deck, or they were in landing craft, which were completely open. I had a feeling of excitement, a realization that at last something was happening, and it was on a tremendous scale. I'm aware that one was part of something which involved many thousands of people and an enormous amount of planning, and also that if it failed, it would be a complete disaster. So it had to succeed. You were aware of that, aware that any role you undertook was more important than ever before. If you're asked to do some particular job well, then you must endeavor your utmost to make sure that you succeeded. We only had one sortie on D-Day, and I think that was due to weather conditions. We flew to the Vannes area in France. We destroyed one train on the way in, which blew up, and another on the way out, so we claimed 2 locomotives. We also attacked a staff car which was on the road. We destroyed it, and it was then that I was obviously shot at by soldiers, because when I came back, I found a .303 bullet in the seat and another through the wing. Just thank God the seat was armor-plated.
You're watching live images from Colleville-sur-Mer and the international ceremony for D-Day. France 24's Chris Moore is there. Chris, we were remarking a short while ago how you have front and center the prime ministers of France and Canada, and sitting next to them, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, the opposition leader, if you will, Nancy Pelosi.
That's right, yes, all sides of the US political debate have been represented across various ceremonies today. What we've been seeing just now, what you've been listening to just now, is representatives, many of them from some of the smaller nations involved in D-Day, young representatives reading out D-Day memories from some of those veterans. And I think that really reflects the theme that the organisers of all these events have tried to underscore today, namely that it's 75 years now. This is likely to be the last time that people are able to pay tribute to the veterans in this form. A lot of these guys are obviously now well into their 90s, some of them well over 100 years of age, and that idea of transmission, of not forgetting of the young taking on the lessons that have been learned is something which I feel has been shared really across many of the events that we've seen today.
Chris Moore, many thanks. Jennifer Ryan, the reading out of these letters by children of all nationalities, a reminder that, well, at the time that the Normandy landing is happening, London is suddenly this melting pot. Of course, the most famous, perhaps, of all those refugees was Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French. But you had, as well, as you can see from now, it's the Greek representative who's reading a letter. Reminder that London was, well, the center of the opposition, if you will, to the Nazis.
Yeah, that's right. It really was, and it was being bombed as well. There was like almost immediately after D-Day, there was a renewed effort by the Nazis to bomb the living daylights out of London, and that's when you start getting the missiles. Rather than sending planes over to drop bombs, you were just getting missiles over, and. I've read accounts of American women who were involved in the Allied headquarters just outside of London, and they were bombed on a regular basis. Not necessarily because the Nazis knew that they were there, but it was just more because there were so many bombs coming down. And they were continually being evacuated. And I think that this was a problem throughout London. I think that the Nazis really saw London as, the center of the Allied headquarters.
Yeah, those V-2 rockets that you describe really gave us, if you will, a renewed momentum to the bombing of civilians in London.
Oh yeah, very much so. The Nazis had been developing them for a number of years, and this is, to put it into context, it's the forerunner to the cruise missiles and absolutely massive rockets, basically, that were just coming down over London. It must have been an incredibly frightening time to be in London. This was a very new war technique that the Nazis were springing. And and it caused an awful lot of devastation. I think because it came a few years after the Blitz, a lot of Londoners were already used to the concept of bombing happening in a big way. So at least there was already a routine of using underground shelters and so forth.
75 years ago. And of course, Jennifer Ryan, there were ties that were bound with many love affairs, many marriages born of that time.
Oh yes, very much so. I think that there was definitely a sense of, live for the moment, very much so. There were both, military deaths and civilian deaths, and this continual threat of invasion. The Nazi war machine was, up and probably until about 1944, 43, 44, was incredibly strong and powerful, and I think that most people in Britain were realistically worried that there was going to be an invasion. And I think people were just living for the moment. There was women of the era that I have interviewed, particularly in London, spoke about this huge sense of freedom. There were no real kind of moral restrictions or anything anymore. People were out partying all the time. There was an awful lot of babies being born out of wedlock. There was an awful lot of very quick marriages happening, and I think that all plays into this moment of, oh my goodness, what is our future going to look like?
All right, many thanks. I know you have to leave us, but Jennifer Ryan, I want to thank you so much for being with us from Washington. A reminder that your new novel, The Spies of Shilling Lane, looks squarely at that. Looks squarely at that period. Thank you for joining us today from Washington during this commemoration. We're listening to the letters being read out by children from all the nationalities that took part in the Normandy landing. This one by the Australian. Let's listen in.
For the Netherlands.
All right, so unfortunately there just caught the tail end of it. Now we're going to hear a letter being read by the representative of the Netherlands, Jacob Field. We talked about the renewed bombing felt on the other side of the Channel or in the days after June the 6th. Of course, the French civilians in and around this area, not very far from Colleville-sur-Mer, where this ceremony is taking place, they lived through a harrowing 2 months, and the bombing came perhaps more from the Allied side than from the German side.
Yeah, well, very much so. At this stage in the war, the Luftwaffe was on the verge of destruction, really. So the Allies had more or less complete aerial superiority over Normandy. And this meant that they could basically bomb a lot of these fortifications into the ground. And in fact, the devastation which was dealt by the Allied air crews was, perhaps as severe as the V1 and V2 missiles over London.
And so the civilian toll is perhaps something that gets overlooked, Dieter Goswinkel, when we look back at D-Day.
You mean if you look at Normandy? I think there were about 20,000 people from Normandy who died in this last phase of the war. And as far as I know, about 60,000 French civilians died from bombings and were implicated in these war in bombings. And this, well, we know about that. And I don't know whether this is something which you want to remind if you are.
Well, because the last few days here in France, we've been hearing reports with radio and television's been giving extensive coverage because we're seeing the last veterans. We're also speaking to some of the last people who had cowed under those bombings. I heard a report on the radio just yesterday with a 94-year-old woman from Caen who had to live in a cave for 2 weeks.
Today, we would call it collateral damage. But at that time, it cost a lot of lives, tens of thousands. And I think this collateral damage was very, very heavy for France. And I think we should think about it and make it more clear that this was something which was necessary, to some extent necessary for the victory over Germany, but it costs a lot of lives.
And today we live in a world where we expect zero collateral damage.
Well, we expect, but we won't have. Drones maybe are an instrument to minimize collateral damage, but even there, no war technique at that time wasn't able to avoid collateral damage. This is a tragic and very bitter part of the war.
Was life cheaper, or there was more of a sense of sacrifice?
I think there was a sense of the war had to be won, Normandy had to be taken, and the lessons of Dieppe and the lessons of other seaborne landings said that you have to have this very heavy aerial bombardment beforehand, and also the fact that these weapons are not very precise. So if you're bombing over an area from a high altitude, if you want to take down one factory, you're going to bomb a whole area. And that means that, civilians are going to be, caught up. And I think we've spoken a lot about the veterans of the war for the 75th. And maybe moving forward, we can start to think as well about the civilians and the civilian sacrifice, which happened not just in Normandy, but across all of World War II.
It's harder to quantify, is it? Here, you see Hollywood movies that portray those soldiers hitting those beaches. It's an easy story to tell. It's much more difficult when we're talking about civilians.
Yeah, I mean, this is why historians have to view things, if we can, a bit more objectively and trying to take in all of the experiences and not just think about something which is glamorous and easy to understand, but think about the fuzzier edges of history, the shades of grey.
And you talked about the veterans in a lot of cases who didn't want to revisit it, didn't want to go back to it. Is it the same in the national psyche when it comes to the sacrifice of civilians?
Well, certainly in terms of sort of British national memory, the British view of ourselves, the Blitz and the Blitz spirit plays a huge role in it. So we like to think of the British people as resilient and able in a crisis to come together and rebuild. And I think this is why Queen Elizabeth II is held in such high regard by the country, because she remained in London throughout the Blitz and was in fact a mechanic in the Women's Auxiliary Forces. So I think understanding the civilian role, the civilian sacrifice, civilian participation in the war means we can understand women as well much better and their role in the factories. So I think, we can look at things much more holistically, perhaps.
Is that being done, you think?
I think today, and over the D-Day celebrations, because it's focusing on one military operation, one military exercise, I don't think it's possible to make it as part of the story. But I think overall, perhaps we can understand a little more the role of civilians and the civilian sacrifice that way.
Germany. All right, we're going to hear a poem read by a representative of Germany. Let's see if we can dip in and listen to the first words, maybe. See if it's...
I came to Caen from Italy in 2015. And my grandfather came there in the 50s from China via Madrid. Both of us came to join an international camp with students coming from all over the world. This war camp was made by Volksbund in the German war cemetery. Visiting Normandy, meeting other different students from other countries, working in the cemetery, and learning to build peace was our holiday. At the cemetery, my grandfather was surprised to see friendship and forgiveness between all enemies. Some had lost their legs or their arms only a few years before. Scars of war everywhere. In 2015, the scars have faded. I became aware of how lucky I was and I am to live in peace, without bombs, hate, and death, but just with that beautiful freedom that allows me to be here today, hoping for a peaceful future.
Pour les États-Unis.
For the United States of America.
From the diary of Navy sailor William J. Verluga, July 11th, 1944. We who are left, modern science shall never again cure our wounds, for our injuries are in our minds, and we alone, with time and rest, will decide on our future and fates. Now, the quiet rolling hills of England have seemed to dim out those awful memories of the past that we are all trying so hard to forget. I know there is nothing in this world that will ever take those memories away from us, regardless of how hard any of us may try. This morning of July 11th also brought to me the news I had so impatiently been waiting for. My wife had given birth to our child, a son, on June 29th. It was as if the world were lifted from my shoulders when I knew once again that she was safe and well. Was it just a coincidence, or was it faith? On that day that had marked my life so bitterly with suffering and death, my wife had brought into this world our son. Now I have only but one desire, and that is to go to those I am so proud of and whom I love so very much, my wife and child. In a few hours, we will be on our way again, a new ship, a new crew, heading for the Mediterranean Sea for what we expect to be the invasion of southern France. Once again, it is goodbye to the shores of England and to those 17 of us who have watched the shores disappear on the horizon so many times before, came those same thoughts. Shall we ever see England again? For we knew the coast of her land meant life, safety, and our mission completed successfully once again. As I leave this time, I now have my son waiting with his mother, waiting for me so that I may come home to help bring him into a world of what we all hope shall be peace amongst all men, fighting so that he and his loved ones shall never have to bear the scars of war. Yes, I have a great deal to live for, and somehow I have a feeling that I shall come back to the both of them. But if it is God's wish that I do not, I shall leave with a prayer that my son shall live a better life and a safer life in his world than the life lived in the world of his father. Thank you.
Pour le Canada.
For Canada.
An excerpt of a letter from Corporal Tom Quinn of Burnaby, British Columbia, to his childhood friend Molly Robertson. The letter was written from an abandoned house in France on July 21st, 1944, during the Battle of Normandy. Extrait d'une lettre du caporal Tom Quinn de Burnaby, Colombie-Britannique, à son ami d'enfance Molly Robertson. La lettre a été rédigée dans une maison abandonnée en France le 21 juillet 1944 durant la bataille de Normandie. Molly, je t'écris cette lettre dans une maison ravagée, une coquille vide en banlieue d'une ville française.
On the outskirts of a French town. It's probably not the time to describe it, although its inhabitants have left it, their spirits remain. I sense their presidents in the wardrobes full of clothes and clean sheets and all sorts of belongings in there.
I looked in the bedroom upstairs, and the tears smarted my eyes as I looked in the tiny cradle with the doll tucked neatly away under the little quilt, as if small hands had done it only last night. The long years rolled back, and I saw my sister's tiny hands tucking the quilt around the silent occupant of that cradle, and heard my sister's voice telling it to go to sleep. The ghosts of the past filled the room to overflowing, so I left. Cette maison m'a fourni l'une des raisons pour lesquelles nous nous battons. Pour préserver l'essentiel d'une civilisation, notre maison, notre chez-soi.
Our house, our home. Molly, write to me, please, even if you have nothing to say. A letter from home strengthens our determination to put an end to this war, so as to go home and return to what we love. Goodbye for now, Tom.
Pour la France.
For France.
Antoine de Saint-Exupéry,
poet and airman, lost in mission in July 1944, wrote, "The future is just the present to be ordered. You don't have to plan for it, but to allow it to happen." 75 years ago, the Allied forces landed in Normandy, facing war on chaos, barbary, and inhumanity. These nations waging war held the hope of enslaved people martyred to renew with a peaceful global order, liberated. On the sand and the cliffs of the Normandy beaches, the first words were written, offering Europe its future. Faced with the uncertainties of our world, let's remember and simply recall these names. As many challenges that young men, in spite of fear, were able to overcome that invite us today to defend peace.
Discours de Monsieur Justin Trudeau, Premier ministre du Canada.
Speech by Mr. Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, chers anciens combattants,
Prime Minister, dear veterans, distinguished guests, good evening. It's with humility and gratefulness that I address you on the 75th anniversary of the Normandy landings. Welcome to Juno Beach, where the Canadians landed. Today, we recall first and foremost a part of our shared history, that of ordinary people, of fathers and sons like you and me who risked their lives to save those of others. Those of brave men who left their families and the life they knew to defend the values that are dear to us, to save a world on the edge of the cliff.
Omaha.
Utah, Omaha, gold, Juno,
sword.
75 years later, these names still resonate in our memories and in our hearts, synonymous of courage, heroism, tenacity. They evoke the sacrifices of our forebears. Over 14,000 Canadians from one ocean to the other fought at the side of their American, British, French and other allies on the battlefields of Normandy. 5,000 of them will never return to their homeland. Thousands of other citizens will experience the same tragic fate during World War II.
Normandy is also one of friendship and solidarity, of strangers who became brothers and changed the course of history. Our men in uniform and their leaders fought back against fascism, authoritarianism, and oppression. They risked everything so the next generation would not know what they could never forget, so we could live in peace. Et bâtir un monde plus pacifique,
and build a more peaceful, equal and fairer world is a struggle that continued well after the war. Rather than become withdrawn and inward-looking, the Allies chose to continue to multiply the bonds of friendship woven on the battlefield, and together they undertook to rebuild a fractured world, united through the desire to avoid a repetition of errors of the past. Those that preceded us led fora that encouraged dialogue and cooperation.
They forged alliances to ensure our security and prosperity. They assembled armies, navies, and air forces capable not only of waging war, but of building peace. Indeed, the world in which we now live is very much a part of our veterans' legacy. And while it is far from perfect, every generation has since strived to build on what began more than 75 years ago. For Canada, this means continuing our proud legacy of peacekeeping and leading reconstruction efforts in war-torn countries. It means playing an active role in key security alliances like NATO. It means empowering women and girls, LGBTQ people, and other marginalized groups to demand and enact change. For Canada, it means standing alongside those who fight for justice, democracy, and equality around the world, just like our boys did once here on Juno Beach. Just like our women and men in uniform serving around the world continue to do to this day. Je sais que pour beaucoup d'entre vous,
I know that for many of you, as for most of the thousands of people who visit Normandy every year, there's a personal bond. And for I too, I was here 2 years ago with my wife Sophie so that our son Xavier might discover his great-uncle Jean-Robert Grédoire from the regiment of La Chaudière, was amongst the 5,000 Canadians who died during the Battle of Normandy. And on his grave, not far from here, in the Ver-sur-mer cemetery, is written a message that we must all take to heart, be brave at home as we were on the battlefields. It is now 75 years that the descendants of the Allied powers meet to commemorate D-Day. We're fortunate in paying tribute to our military past and present. Every day, be it by embodying the values for which they fought, by multiplying the bonds of friendship that they forged, by playing an active role on the international stage, it is now up to us to build a world worthy of those who sacrificed so much 75 years ago. And while I look around me today, I'm proud to see so many people who have already undertaken this task. Thank you.
Discours de Monsieur Édouard Philippe, Premier ministre de la République française.
Speech by Mr. Édouard Philippe, Prime Minister of the French Republic.
Monsieur le Premier ministre, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres,
Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, elected officials, ambassadors,
les anciens combattants,
veterans,
Mesdames et Messieurs, chers élèves,
ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear friends,
des deux côtés du mur,
on both sides of the wall, the wait was endless. The Atlantic Wall, 4,000 kilometers of coastline full of guns, mines and bunkers, split the world into two, not just geographically, but in two visions of humankind and history. After months of training, 160,000 Allied soldiers had raw nerves. All their thoughts were focused on the 5 beaches, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Some would return after the war with their wives and children, not all, but all knew why they were fighting.
The elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe and security for ourselves in a free world. Tels furent les mots du général Eisenhower.
Those were the words of General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, on the 6th of June 1944. Arms in hand, the free world was getting ready to overthrow Nazi totalitarianism. On the eve of landing, Europe was on its knees. Occupation has sorely tested the values and unity of an old continent. In the Normandy campaign, suffering from fratricidal warfare, the resistance leaders are awaiting, the propaganda battles are raging. And all of a sudden, the 1st of June, on the BBC, the long sanglot of the autumn violins. The 5th of June, a second verse retouched by history doesn't wound them, as with Verlaine, but lulls them with an ardor that is not monotonous. From the 5th to 6th of June, the first warriors take to the skies. The 106th Airborne and the 6th British Airborne Division, when they set foot on French soil, midnight has just struck at the Saint-Lô church. Many are caught out in the trap of Nazi soldiers, But the 80th takes Sainte-Mère l'Église. The liberation of continental Europe has begun. In the silence of the night, broken by the first notes of the bagpiper piper bill, the wind and the swell carry the vessels. Sailors, soldiers, and airmen see the shores of the opposite coast emerge, the far shore which for some will be the destination of their last journey. From the four corners of the world, it was the armada of the free world that was going to lift up Europe. Wave after wave, their progression begins to sketch out the V of victory. Low tide across the coastline, it was a condition of success to distinguish the obstacles installed by Rommel. But at 6:35, it's an icy cold dawn in Normandy. Eisenhower had in fact decided to postpone D-Day by 24 hours, owing to dreadful weather conditions. When the first GIs land on Oberhard Beach, they're very cold, like all soldiers before battle. They're afraid. In a few minutes, each hour looks like apocalypse. Surrounded by their men, they suffer a deluge of fire. This band of brothers has no time to save their brothers in arms. They receive an extra ration of blood, sweat and tears announced by Churchill to his people in his first speech of May 40, and as predicted by Churchill in his second speech of June 1940, they fight on the beaches and on the landing field, in the dunes and in the fields.
With growing confidence and growing strength, whatever the cost may be.
4 years after the rescue of Dunkirk, D-Day opens a bridgehead into Calvados, a breach to snatch the Europeans from the jaws of shame. With the Battle of Normandy, Phase 2 of Overlord begins. Normandy is liberated in Pays. Saint-Lô is nicknamed the capital of ruins by Samuel Beckett at the Red Cross Hospital when Caen, Lisieux become martyred city 3 months after the landing. Le Havre will be crushed by more bombs in 2 days than fell over London during the Blitz. The members of Le Havre, of which I'm one, whose town was razed, know the price of victory. Today, 75 years after D-Day, we must say that we owe our liberty to the warriors of Overlord. Some of the soldiers who died illustrated themselves in Africa, Sicily, or Salerno. Some wished to be worthy of a father who had faced World War I. Others had asked for nothing. They went against their will, but they had the stuff of heroes. They weren't all the children of World War I warriors, but they all fought to put an end to this World War that began in 1914. In Normandy, a sharp recollection of this landing is handed down from generation to generation. It still marks our family history and tales. Our pride and our gratefulness remain intact. No Frenchman, no European people will forget the sacrifice of US, Canadian, British, Australian, New Zealand, Polish, Belgium soldiers, all those who cross seas and land for our leaders' liberty. With the representatives of all leaders present today in Normandy, I wish to express our profound and eternal gratitude. Let's not forget the young Germans who fell on these beaches. In 1944, they were the enemy soldiers. Today, they too rest nearby, and their children, their grandchildren, are not just our allies, they're also our friends. The pride and gratefulness that we maintain for the soldiers of the liberation, we express also to those who inherited their bravery, who give their lives to defend our values throughout the world. I'm, of course, thinking with great emotion of Maître Cédric de Pierrepont and Alain Sello, who died as heroes in Burkina Faso on the night of the 9th to 10th of May last. These Marines belonged to the Hubert Commando, owes its name to a captain who died in Ouistreham in 1944, having landed with Commando Kiefer. All our citizens who fight perilously against terrorism are in the glorious lineage of the heroes of that battle. A few months after the ceremonies of the centenary of 1918, we celebrate today a concord. The concord between our European peoples that it falls to us to preserve tirelessly. First of all, by listening to the veterans who transmit wisdom and humility that is inestimable of their testimony. The flame that they hand to us is symbolically taken up by these young girls and boys who just read in the diversity of their testimonials and languages. The same call for peace also taken up by teachers or parents who take their children to see the remains of the overlord operation. Having experienced this at first hand, often been surprised or moved by the gaze of children who, discovering military cemeteries, a line upon a line that has just been referred to, read the names and try and guess the ages. And because they see names, understand or feel the absence and proximity of young people barely older than themselves, sometimes come from afar, and they still benefit from their sacrifice. The flame of the veterans is taken up by all those who understand the reality of war and everything that makes it heroic and less glorious, as did Svetlana Alexeyevich, the Nobel Prize for Literature. In her book, she describes an unknown war, that of women not just on the side of civilians, but who were also snipers, mine clearance officers, so that the reader feels nauseous in reading it, that the very idea of war seems crazy and heinous, that of stretcher carrier who notes the same gaze of children as though she's left in their children as much as the dread and tears that no longer ran their desire to live and give life in spite of everything. It falls to us, ladies and gentlemen, to all of us, to describe the dread and the tears, but above all to act, to affirm our desire to live in peace, in the concord of nations, to live free. Thank you.
France's Prime Minister Edouard Philippe at the international ceremony commemorating the 75th anniversary of D-Day. We've been listening to that speech in the company of historian Jacob Field, the author of D-Day in Numbers. One of the striking points that we heard in both the speech by Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the one we just heard is the predominant place accorded to ordinary people, tales of ordinary soldiers, a bit like with many of the letters that were read out by those young people beforehand. It seems as though it's less about the great leaders these days and more about hearing about ordinary tales.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we have a sense of history from below and a sense of what it was like for the men, many of whom were conscripted, many of whom were extremely young, to go into battle, sometimes for the first time. And I think this really brings history to life. It makes you realize that it wasn't about generals and admirals moving around figures on maps and charts. It was actually about these people who went into war, and reading their letters makes you realize the huge personal sacrifice they made and the huge anxiety about what they're about to do.
Just to remind our viewers, the images you're seeing are of the leaders who are going to, as part of the ceremony, now head to the beach. This is a beachfront ceremony taking place at what was codenamed Juno Beach, the Canadian sector in Colleville-sur-Mer. And they're going to lay wreaths together on the beachfront to commemorate, of course, the event that began before dawn, as was stated in those two speeches we heard in the night of June the 5th to June the 6th. Jacob Field, the memory of D-Day, of course, didn't begin at dawn. It began during the night with parachute drops that were more or less successful.
Yeah, more or less successful. So the very first Allied troops arrived at 6 minutes past midnight, some by parachute, some by glider. And as you say, in war, nothing always goes to plan. So only about 1 in 6 of the parachutes actually landed in the place they were planned to land. Yeah, they were really scattered and blown around by wind because they had to land at very low altitudes.
And the weather was terrible, by the way.
Terrible weather. So the men crossing by sea were seasick. And for a lot of the airborne troops, it was their first time jumping into combat.
Yeah, so they land, and their mission there was to try to secure as much as possible beforehand.
Yeah, so they had to secure the flanks of the beachhead to make sure that Germans couldn't come in and outflank them. They had to conquer specific strategic targets like bridges and roads, and some of them had to link up with the French resistance. But also they had to make sure that the Germans were very occupied while the amphibious landings were taking place, because when you're landing by sea, you're hugely vulnerable.
We're going to take a look now as the leaders lay those wreaths on Juno Beach.
Un pas à droite. Marche. Demi-tour. Droite. En avant. Marche.
watching live coverage from the international ceremony marking the 75th anniversary of D-Day from Juno Beach in Normandy, and the national anthems of all of the Allied nations being played. You hear the Star-Spangled Banner there. We're in the company of historian Jacob Field, the author of D-Day in Numbers. Also with us as we see Nancy Pelosi, the U.S. House of Representatives Speaker, who is there among those in attendance. We're also in the company of Emma James of Media Watch fame. Emma, as we watch the ending of this ceremony against that dramatic backdrop there of low tide at Colleville-sur-Mer, the first time ever that the ceremony has taken place in the Canadian sector of D-Day, we've been talking about the fact that more and more of the focus is on tales of ordinary civilians, ordinary soldiers on the day, and less so than it used to be on leaders as such.
Yes, and I think broadly speaking, that's because we're catching on to the fact that really there are so few of these veterans left now, and every word that they speak seems to carry so much more weight and so much more importance. Of course, there's lots of analysis out there in the media today on the coded and not so coded political messages of the world leaders. But certainly my focus has been very much looking at the veterans. There was a new British memorial unveiled today at Ver-sur-mer overlooking Gold Beach. And that one really shows how memorials have changed over the years. We're used to those very sort of blocky, simple, just names. But this, a very beautiful sculpture done by a British sculptor called David Williams Ellis. And this headline from The Guardian, "Comrades Forever," I think sums that up really rather beautifully. It's been a very busy itinerary today for the 75th anniversary. It is, of course, expected to be the last time we will see veterans at one of these big 5-year celebrations. The day started down in Bayeux, where we had lots of British veterans who, Bayeux basically known as the first town to be liberated here in France. Kenneth Hay was among the Brits. There he is, giving a salute as he arrived at that ceremony, and they're sharing some words with the youngsters, because of course it's so important for that message to go to the next generation, the generation that didn't witness any of this for itself. He was just 18, Kenneth Hay, when he landed on the beaches. He's now 93, took centre stage at the service in Bayeux to read a poem by another Normandy veteran, Cyril Crane, who didn't live to the age to witness this ceremony. And I'm not sure if you want to hear the Marseillaise. Should we break in for that one? So as I was saying, Kenneth Hay, a British veteran who spoke today at the ceremony, he read a poem written by another veteran, and the words really are almost too poignant to bear, coming as they did from the mouth of an old soldier. Take a listen.
When my life is over and I reach the other side, I'll meet my friends from Normandy and shake their hands with pride.
I must admit there was not a dry eye in my house when I heard that this morning. And the reason for that is because I actually met Ken Hay 5 years ago. He is a wonderful veteran, so full of life. and I was absolutely thrilled to see him at the ceremony today. I put aside my vanity, it's a terrible photograph of me, but that really encapsulates what an amazing gentleman he is. He was just 18 then, he's 93 now. Where I met him, and it's worth bearing this in mind, was at a memorial for the Hill 112 battle, a battle that took place just over a month after the D-Day landings. And it shows how little progress they'd made, really. They'd basically made a kilometre of ground for every day since D-Day, just over 30 kilometres away from where they landed on the beaches in Normandy. Hill 112 was one of the bloodiest battles, but often very much forgotten in the fight to gain ground in Normandy. Now, I was there in 2004. I was there again in 2014. This photograph I took there 5 years ago, and who knows how many of these people will be there again. Now, it's an amazing spirit that these veterans have, and it's why they hold such a special place in certainly many reporters' hearts. It's a real privilege to cover these stories.
Yeah, just as we can see the images of the French Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister, and Nancy Pelosi returning to the rostrum where they're going to be saluting those veterans, Emma, that you mentioned. One final question on the points you bring up, Emma, to Jacob Field, which is that, I mean, Emma, like myself, you know, we've met these veterans at previous D-Day ceremonies, and they have an aura about them. In the U.S., there's an expression called the greatest generation, because contrary to those who then went to war in Vietnam or in later conflicts, there was no misgivings or qualms about their struggle.
No, not at all. I mean, this, you know, as we said earlier, it's a war between darkness and light. And we can identify these men as heroes in a way which is much more difficult with wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and dare I say in 50 years' time with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So when we talk about these men and pay tribute to them, because they're not going to be around for the next celebration.
Yes, absolutely. When I was at that ceremony 5 years ago, there was a moment during the ceremony where the Padre talked about a new statue that was to be unveiled on the 75th anniversary. We're coming up to it now. And he said, "We hope to see you all back here again." And there was a moment of silence and then a ripple of laughter. And somebody said very loudly, "God willing, lads, it's only 5 years," which was just, and everybody laughed, and it was just a wonderful atmosphere. And I think the other thing that encapsulates really the spirit of these veterans, it's on the front page of La Presse de la Manche, the press of the Channel.
The local newspaper.
The local newspaper. 97-year-old Tom Rice, who came in with the paratroopers in 1944. He did it again at the age of 97 yesterday. Their headline, very simply, "Thanks again."
All right, many thanks for that. And we see those images of the veterans being saluted by Prime Minister Edouard Philippe and Justin Trudeau of Canada. And it's on those images that we're going to leave you. I want to thank you, Emma James. I want to thank Jacob Field for being with us. Our coverage of D-Day and more news still to come here on France 24.